Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. 1.7 million people rely on the TTC every day. That is the public transit system in Toronto. And anyone who has ever lived there will tell you it's wholly inadequate in meeting the needs of the city's residents or the folks who have to bus in every day to work in the city they can't afford to live in. Even with an annual budget of over $2 billion and monthly passes that cost $156, service cuts continue to plague the system. These cuts mean things like canceled routes, longer wait times, overcrowding on the subways and buses, stress on the system, all of which have real impacts to real people, mostly low-income people. I absolutely dreaded my daily commute when I worked in the downtown core. Having to make transfers at the busiest stations just wreaked havoc on my anxiety. It set the tone for my entire day and was just awful for my mental health as a whole. And it seems like there's always more service cuts and fare hikes on the way. It's also not uncommon to have massive expansion, much needed expansion projects stall, miss targets by years, or even fail to materialize altogether. The Scarborough RT, Rapid TO, the Eglinton Crosstown. As an alumni of York, I spent my whole time there watching the completion date sign get scratched out, a new sticker put up with the date pushed back and back. I never did get to take the subway to school, despite it being promised by the end of my first year there. That, of course, is public-private partnerships for you. Toronto also has a mayor's race on right now, and there are a lot of people desperate to get transit to the top of the issues list without it resulting in demands for more cops. This all means a lot of work for advocates of public transit in Toronto, and there is one group in particular that appears at the forefront of demanding better. They are TTC Riders. They use a variety of tactics to highlight the many, many threats facing public transit, and as we'll hear, sometimes to cause quite a stir. We're lucky to have a pair of volunteers from TTC Riders joining us for this episode. A veteran of the movement, so to speak, someone who's been with the group since its beginnings, and a youth, newer to activism. Two different perspectives on the fight for public transit, hopefully one day free public transit. They will tell you why this avenue of advocacy is crucial to the people of Toronto and the fight against climate change. They'll also explain what it is about TTC Riders as an organization that keeps them engaged while securing some impressive victories over the years. Here's Jamie and Herman. Welcome, Jamie and Herman. Starting with Jamie, can you both introduce yourselves to the audience?
Hello, I'm Jamie. I'm a transit enthusiast and transit advocate with TTC Riders. And I ride transit normally like 4 times a day, so I notice a lot of the issues that transit riders are facing. And especially like reliability, frequency, and safety are all issues that TTC Riders is hoping to fix.
Thanks, Jamie. Herman, what about you?
Yeah, my name's Herman, Herman Rosenfeld. I'm retired union staff person. I used to work for the Canadian Auto Workers, and I've been with TTC Riders since they began, about 15 years ago, 10 years. It's hard to remember exactly when. And I take public transit often when I travel across the city. I cycle, and very rarely I drive, but and I think public transit's an absolutely essential component of challenging climate change, and also dealing with livable cities, livable country.
Perfect. So one of my first questions right out the bat is, why public transit? there are a lot of causes that people get behind these days, right? There's all sorts of areas you can get into. What made each of you decide you would put some efforts towards securing public transit, improving public transit in Toronto?
So on a personal note, I'm a big transit enthusiast, so it's something I love and I want to see it be better. But I also think that it's something that affects so many people, and it's much better for the environment than driving, and is obviously like faster for long distances than walking or cycling, which are also great options. But yeah, so I think it's something that should be a service for everyone. And when we cut back service or when we make fares inaccessible to people, those are big issues that we shouldn't be seeing. And so, yeah, I like to see it be better for everyone.
So you see it as a key to improving quality of life at the same time as fighting climate change?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it helps all sorts of people get to jobs and friends and family.
Yeah, perfect. Herman, why is this like one of your niches? I'm sure it's not all that you do, I'm not implying that, but what makes your passion in transit particularly?
Well, partly similar things that Jamie was saying, which I share. I started out with, I'm a socialist. I was involved in a number of these different projects, and one of them was around building a movement for fare-free transit. And the idea was transit should be like going to the library, like Medicare should be. It should be a non-commodified right. One of the components of building a different kind of a society, like housing shouldn't be commodified either. But we started this little group and Free Transit Toronto, and then one of the activists who wanted to transform TTC Riders, which was mostly a paper organization at the time, into an activist organization, a membership, Jessica Bell, and she asked me, would you like to help me do this? So I did. And I think a lot of the reasons are similar. It's, I think particularly, it's a central way of addressing climate change. And in particular, if you look at the debates that are going on now about investments in personal vehicles that are electrically driven, instead of all that investment there, that should be in public transit for jobs, for the structure of how we move around, and for transforming the society in a way that we need to do that, both in terms of decommodifying components of our life and also in terms of addressing the climate emergency, because it isn't just something that's out there.
We were talking about that the other day, that, electrical vehicles are often pushed as a big solution, but that's a real kind of classist approach. Even with the rebates that we used to have, most people can't afford an electric vehicle, but the idea, I guess, is to make transit absolutely affordable. You say the decommodification of transit. I hear free transit. I know you were part of the free transit movement, or are. Is that incorporated into TTC Riders?
Well, the TTC Riders would like to move in that direction. We've talked about it. And the strategy we've looked at would be increasing the population that doesn't have to pay for transit. We were part of this movement towards low-income fares, but the bottom line for that was that people on social assistance, who in fact organized, demanded that it be free for them, and that would be one of the ways of cutting in the direction of both lowering fares, but of increasing the amount of people, the numbers of people that and the demographics that would have free transit. So eventually we would do that. There's always been this debate, not in TTC Riders, but in the transit universe, about how you pay for transit, because you have to pay. And traditionally in Toronto, it's a very conservative city, in terms of its elite, or its political elite in particular. And this whole you see some of the people like Halliday or Rob Ford and stuff, like they come from that tradition that, you should pay for this. We're customers and all that kind of stuff. And we challenge that. So, it's not that TTC Riders raise that as an immediate demand, because it's something we're not going to win tomorrow, but something we work towards. And though some of us are think about this more than others, but fundamentally the organization moves in that direction. Would you agree, Jamie?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's difficult to like the debates about how you're gonna pay for transit if no one's actually paying a fare. But I do think, especially for lower income people and people like who are younger and also like older and unemployed, it is an extremely important thing to push for.
So if you do that, and it becomes, then it's easier to argue this be for everybody. Because fundamentally, like public transit isn't just something for the people, the poorest people. Although poorest people absolutely depend upon transit for everything. But it's something that should be the way we travel, the way cities are structured, and not just relegated for the people who are at the lower end of the economic ladder. In fact, we want to change that, about people being at the lower end of the economic ladder. Anyway.
I hear that. You talked about demands. Free transit is not one of your demands, but a vision. But you folks have a lot of demands, and I don't mean that as a criticism. What I am getting at is there's so many moving parts when it comes to just Toronto's transit. I have a list here. You have to keep track of the service cuts and their impact. You got a mayor's race that you have to analyze, the budget to keep on top of and inform people of, the policing narrative that's going on in response to, safety concerns, fare hikes, pushing back against that, as well as moving towards, free transit, and then keeping folks accountable. We're talking about like rapid TO and the Scarborough solutions, and like reminding people that promises aren't being made, realizing that promises aren't being made. This is a lot of information to keep on top of. It's a lot to keep your supporters on top of. Like, how do you fight on so many fronts, and how do you stay on top of so many moving parts? What's your secret?
I think Herman can probably answer this better than me because he's been with TTC Riders a lot longer. But from what I've seen over the past year or so, is that we have a lot of dedicated people who are like very passionate about the advocacy, and they stay on top of so many different topics. It's very impressive, really. And then we work with other advocacy groups who have like more niche focuses that sort of intersect with some of our projects. And so they're also able to keep track on things. But yeah, I'm not sure if Herman has more to add about it.
Before Herman goes, do you want to shout out any of those organizations? Who do you kind of lean on sometimes?
I think Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty is one of them. We've worked with them a lot for the safety report. I know there are so many others, but I can't remember their exact names right now. I'm so sorry.
No, look at the shopping centers, there are community hubs, and I think Jamie basically summarized it, except I would add one more thing, that we have an executive director who isn't paid a CEO's wages, and she is incredible in terms of making sure that her name is Sheila Paisialan, that she keeps up on all of this, and that plugs in the sort of the clumps of young people in some places, older people in different communities, and actually is a spark plug for keeping this thing going. And there's a young person that she has working with her. Monica's doing that stuff now, and a whole series of other people. The person who's very active around disability issues, and there's people that work a lot around this, and there's a whole sort of a new layer of younger people that I think Jamie's part of that cohort sort of. That in different communities, but we were mostly downtown for a long time in terms of advocating, important issues and trying to organize people to go to City Hall and all that sort of stuff, City Council meetings. Those are important things, but we didn't have like a base in other parts of the city, and that base is being built around younger people who from different communities who live in those places, and a lot of them are really young, even high school kids, and that's pretty special.
Is that you, Jamie? Are you in high school?
Yeah, grade 10, halfway through. And yeah, I completely agree with Herman. Sheila and Monica and a lot of other people at TTC Riders do so much heavy lifting. It's incredible.
I didn't mean to ask you this, but I wonder if you can lend some insight into what I consider a bit of a phenomenon. When I was in high school and in grade 10, and that wasn't too long ago, but I'm probably older than you think, and I'm sure, I don't know, maybe Herman can relate as well. I don't remember being that politicized. And I came from a very political family, so I was aware of politics, but the drive to act in this way and the bravery to come on a podcast, honestly, was not something I would have possessed at that age. But I'm seeing so much of it, especially on the climate front. And I think like a lot of people can agree with that. What's happening here? Like, what drives you and your friends? Like, how come you're not hanging out at the mall and like parking lots and like what we used to waste our time with? How are you motivated? Like, and I'm so happy that you are. Like, just maybe you can help our audience who might be a little bit on the older scale understand this.
Yeah, so I can't speak for everyone, but for me personally, sort of what I said earlier, like I just want to see things improving. So specifically with transit, I'd like to do that now in ways I can help. And I think it also just gives me better knowledge about the topics that I'm interested in. Also transit, but more, I think, with climate activism. People are also just like really scared about the future. Like, I'm not sure what my life or other people's lives are going to look like in even 10 years because we're not doing enough to solve the climate crisis. And so, yeah, if you don't act now, then, yeah, who knows what's going to happen later. But I assure you, there is definitely still a lot of going to the mall and the parking lot. Yeah.
Well, that's good. It's deserved. That's part of being young. There's no judgment there. Well, thank you. And yeah, I know you're not answering for everybody, but I'm grateful that you use your free time this way. And because the reason we have this show is because not everybody does. More and more people are, but almost all of us recognize that there's a problem. We just don't know what to do about it. And I'm glad you folks are finding avenues or creating them. What is it about TTC Riders, though, that keeps you engaged? You know, a lot of our audience does organizing. They want more young people on board. They want growth like they see in other organizations. Like I see a lot of committee work that goes on with your group, a lot of press releases that are hitting the right marks, direct actions. What's your kind of favorite part about TTC Riders that they do that makes you want to put your time in there, other than your love for transit? Like about the actions or the structure?
I think from what I've seen, there's sort of something for everyone to do. Like for me, recently I did like some graphic design work for an upcoming safety report that we're doing. And so that was a way I could help without like having the time to do like heavy research and like writing of a report. And it was something I was already interested in beforehand. So, and then if you want to go like engage with the community, we have a lot of those sorts of activities too. So I think that's one way that we keep people engaged. And my favorite thing so far that TTC Riders has done was painting like temporary bus lanes on Dufferin because the city delayed that indefinitely. And
Tell us more. Did you do that? Were you part of that?
I was unfortunately not part of that, but
I was.
oh, amazing. But yeah, when I saw it the morning it happened, I was so amazed. I went over to see it before it got, I believe the city removed it. And it just shows that you don't need to take years to make transit riders experience better. You can do it so soon. Yeah, so that was probably my favorite thing they've done so far.
I love that. You weren't even involved with it, but it brought you a sense of joy, right? And it probably even people who weren't involved at all saw it and were inspired or at least, driven by it at some point. Herman, tell me a little bit more of that. Can you? Are you legally allowed to?
Well, for me, the reason why the TTC Riders is going is because of the issue, and we're trying to take on those issues. That's the issue. Because, movements, they come and go, all of them. Without an ongoing political a permanent political or larger political organization of some kind. These movements, they come and they go. But transit is such a central thing. And also TTC Riders has links to the labor movement and also to some of the longer term, like the Toronto Environment Alliance that have been around. But and also the things that Jamie was saying. The climate crisis is the kind of issue that's touching a lot of younger people right now. When I was in high school, I wasn't that politicized, but I went to school in the 60s, okay, in Newark, New Jersey, so it's different. But it was mostly against the Vietnam War and fighting against poverty. But this is a critical front in the fight against public transit. You read the papers today, about how the federal government and the provincial government are looking at how much money to give to these American companies, international companies, to build battery plants, right? Instead of using $13 billion to rebuild the public transit infrastructure in cities, which could mean the same amount of jobs. So those kinds of things, I think, inspire us to do these things, the bigger things. And but the movement is really doing all kinds of stuff now, and it has a lot to do with the stuff. There's a lot of shit to do. A lot of around transit, it's important. And remember every one Friday a month there was a strike by students. Well, that's stopped by COVID. But I think a lot of that energy is the kind of energy that is getting some of the young people involved in something like TTC Riders. I've seen transit movements in some other cities, and they're often, since public transit is only for the poor in, say, I remember it was Edmonton and in Regina and stuff, or Niagara. In other words, it's not something that's seen as a class issue of working people, or something that's bigger, because around the climate change, you need lots of people. So TTC Riders has that attitude, and it's good. So that's why I'm still involved, and I've been involved for 15 years or so. But it's not all I do, but I think it's absolutely essential. And also, once again, somebody like Sheila, who actually is able to plug into groups of young people, like high school students, and I think that's really critical.
Can you tell us a little bit about the painting of the lanes on Joffrin? Just because,
yes, you want to
Jamie
hear about
got a real kick out of it, and I saw a look on your face. I do want to hear about it.
Well,
How do you folks pull that off?
What it was is that the city keeps on saying there will be bus lanes, but they won't pay for it, and they won't really get to do it. So we figured, well, we're going to show them how to do it, and we got kids paint, so it would rub off easily, it would wash off. And we went to near Dufferin Station, and people sussed out the space. We got there early, we sussed out the space the night before, and then early in the morning the next day, we drove people there and materials, and we just went out and painted it. And then we went back after, we went just as if it never happened. So, and it got in the news, and it excites. That kind of thing is exciting. It's low risk. It's not something that's confrontational, although there are places for confrontational stuff, and it gets a message out. And that's a lot of the kind of stuff in that kind of vein that TTC Riders has done. Like this, I remember once we had this, whatchamacallit, the sardine cans, because there was the packaging, so we all made up these pretend sardine cans. And we went to the
because people are packed into subways.
Yes, and buses in particular. So he went to the head of the TTC at the time and gave them an award as I forget, as Sardine King, as that kind of stuff. And there's other analogs to that, so the kinds of things that people have done. So but around the low income fairs, we had these. This is before COVID. We'd have hundreds of people go to TTC meetings or executive board meetings. That was before the, sort of people stopped coming out. People are starting to do that again. And we'd interrupt meetings and, basically make points or shout slogans or that sort of stuff, but also pose questions like we do now, when you can depute. But in those days, there were very pointed questions and very deep struggles. And people like Doug Ford, who's now the premier, used to say, well, used to ask, so what are you going to do to make efficiencies? You know, he's asked the same stupid question about cuts. But anyway, so there's a lot of creative things. And yes, that painting that thing was pretty fun anyway.
Yeah, no, it's nice to hear those because it also speaks to what Jamie was talking about of there being a real range of activities for folks to partake in. You know, not everyone is comfortable with going out and, you know, painting city roads, but, you know, it takes a range of tactics too to get where you guys need to go. So it's nice to hear that because, again, you've got a really good comms strategy from an outsider's perspective anyway, you know, going through the amount of times you folks get featured, not just your direct actions, but your voices, right? Your perspectives, your questions to the mayor and demands of the mayoral candidates. And that's sometimes not easy to do from a grassroots perspective. And I imagine, or maybe I'll ask you, I won't surmise, who are you speaking to mostly when you do your work? You know, are you trying to speak to politicians to make better choices? Or are you trying to mobilize the communities around you to create that political pressure? I mean, maybe you're doing both, but the bulk of your work, who do you think it's aimed at? Jamie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can try to. I think it is definitely both. Like when we were sort of planning, like the early stages of our safety report, which I was working on a lot, there was a big question of whether we should write it for the politicians and be very technical, or whether we should have a more simplified version towards just the general public, so that they can understand it and understand also how they can get involved to help. So yeah, I think it sort of depends on the project, and you need to mobilize the community to get change to happen. If no one else is asking for the change, it's not going to happen. But you do also need to force politicians to make the changes. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen either. So they do go hand in hand, and I think we do a bit of both.
Herman, like that's a great answer from someone, and I hate to bring up your age again, but I'm just in awe because, Jamie, what you're going to do with that kind of knowledge to understand that there's different levers of pressure when you want political change is like you're light years ahead of where most of us were. You know, like a lot of us know to make noise, but, you know, starting to learn where to direct that noise and who's likely to aid in, you know, your mission. That, you know, sometimes that has to come with a lot of trial and error. So hearing that come from the both of you, and just like, I'm already impressed with the organization and just the knowledge base it seems to be building as well in its members and in the public.
So there's a mutual dependence about what Jamie was saying, you know. You can't get politicians, particularly in a nominally depoliticized, say nominally, because they don't have parties in Toronto. But even so, the political parties there's very little difference between the Liberals and the NDP on the one hand, and certainly on the Conservatives. There are differences, but you want exactly what Jamie said. You build a mass base and you pressure these people to do some of the things you need them to do. If you stop that pressure, they will not do anything. And whatever they do, unfortunately, has to articulate with the needs of business, which is a problem. Nobody's challenging the domination that business has in the province, in the country, and the city, which is the biggest hub, like the biggest hub of the economy. And so that relationship is always important. But for an organization like ours, which also wants important short-term reforms and has them, like, for example, the 2-hour time you can get off the subway and in the bus and do things and not have to pay again. That's something that TTC Riders was one of the leaders in pushing. And also this thing right now about the busway, a dedicated busway replacing the RT in Scarborough. There are others, but these things, they require that you do both things, that you build a base and that you pressure politicians. But for me, the critical point is always the base. and having an organization which is not just, the difference between organizing and mobilizing, in the sense that a relatively small number, even though we have a lot more people, that mobilize other people and get things done. That's where we're at this stage. But you want to have an organization eventually which has a big meeting, has big meetings, big mass base, not just names that you call up. And the people who call, they're an increasing number. And Jamie's an example of saying those things, of describing that. But you want to be able to build in the communities a transit movement, which isn't natural necessarily. You can't look at the last 40 years and say there's been all these transit movements. It's something that we have to build, and we are starting to build in a particular way. But those of us who are more skeptical about the politicians also realize that we want them to make certain kinds of decisions, and unless you study who they are, what their perspectives are, how to pressure them, and that sort of thing, then we'll be around getting people. We won't get any results. But we've got some results because that balance, that contradiction is always going to be there. So,
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that struggle that you mentioned in having a strong transit movement, especially in the past, when so many people rely on it, but maybe not the right people. And you mentioned it earlier, there's quite a few issues that typically resonate more with low-income folks than they do with workers, even though we have plenty of workers that are low income, right? But I'm talking mostly folks in legislated poverty that just don't get prioritized or just don't gain the momentum that they need for change, and that's typically because it's hard to build larger alliances around that don't involve specifically worker issues. Even though you've made the case that, transit is an everybody issue, it's just not typically seen that way. Do you think that plays into the difficulty in creating a larger mass transit movement? And if I'm completely wrong, where are your areas of resistance? Who's fighting you on keeping transit public or moving towards a free transit scenario?
well, there's a difference between vested interests and wealthy interests around things like public-private partnerships, about serving these, like these condo areas and that sort of stuff, how to build gentrification, that kind of stuff. And also, there's a difference in terms of getting people some confidence to be able to do things. Because people who are, when I say working class issue, I don't just mean an employment issue or in workplaces. Class stratus, exists in social reproduction, in housing, in communities. And components of the working class who are less organized because they don't have the economic power, right? They're going to be weaker in a lot of ways, which means that the form of organization needs to be powerful. And they need to be organized in ways that are articulated with other workers who are in different, like, for example, transit workers, or workers who people have to get across town, who rely on transit. And also workers who drive, which is probably one of the contradictions, But you want to be able to organize all of those people. And the barriers are partly, for the elites. They don't want transit movements, or they want a transit movement that fits in with their vision of where the city should be built. And also the notion, the reality that amongst lower income communities, there's less public transit, right? Even the buses are, the service is being cut. There's, like this whole LRT network that was supposed to be built and paid for by the conference of province, Rob Ford Nix. And so, in communities with food deserts, with, those kinds of things, there's transit deserts as well. And that's why we trying really hard to organize people in places like parts of Scarborough, in parts of North York, in all kinds of places, in alliance with other people who are doing this. I mean, this woman who was a housing activist, Padavani was her name. She lost by 94 votes to one of the most conservative politicians in part of Toronto, and we helped working with them. We're not a non. We don't work for any particular political organization, but we're raising certain issues. It's pretty obvious the kind of people we want to do. So I mean, the obstacles are from the people who don't want the kind of transit we do, and don't necessarily want to build, and don't particularly care about whether there's whether transit fares are low or not. And the other obstacle is that people aren't used to being organized, particularly people in communities that that have never organized around public transit, around transit. It's not as if there's a 70-year-old history of these movements. There isn't. And this is part of what TTC Riders is, a part of a generation of building this kind of a movement. And it's within different stratum of the working class that we're working with. So,
Jamie, what about you? Like, what are the biggest barriers, even if they're personal, to kind of getting this work done?
Yeah, so personally, I'm very busy with school and sports and all that. So I struggle to find time, and I think advocacy is a very time-demanding thing to do. But more so on the larger scale, I think just finding ways to mobilize and convince people of making these changes is very difficult. Funding is something that I find, especially in government, is very iffy. Like
funding
even
for
rapid
transit or funding for your organization and like the work you do?
Funding for transit.
Okay.
Yeah, like so with
Probably
Rapid TO. Probably both, yeah, but yeah, like with Rapid TO, for example, I think the whole network was supposed to be finished by now, and then they were like, okay, actually, maybe we're not going to fund this. And there are so many more examples, and it's a lot. It's not very much money. And like Herman's been saying earlier too, with like EV rebates and stuff, that money could also just be better spent on improving public transit.
Do you think, Jamie, this question's for you. Do you think folks rely on, when I say folks, I mean the people in power that make promises and don't keep them. Do you think they rely on people being too busy to pay attention or too busy to do anything about it? A lot of your work seems to be holding people accountable to promises they've already made. I mean, it's a lot of work getting a policy passed or advocating for it. You get it passed, and then they just don't do it. So how do you think they can get away with that?
Honestly, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure about the general public and like the majority, but for transit advocates, we notice when politicians don't do things, and we definitely try to keep them accountable. So I don't think it's a very good strategy. In the short term, it can make them look good supporting something, but in the long term, it definitely makes them seem like very like not untrustworthy, and like just politicians who aren't very accountable for improving services. So it's. Sorry, Herman, go ahead.
No, I'm going to say they're saying a lot now that the public mood is more towards moving towards more activist, more progressive, at least in Toronto for now. And it's in line, I think, with what Jamie just said. But most of the politicians who are not coming up from the activist communities are business types, or they're funded by developers. And we know who we're talking about. They're funded by
almost all of them,
or by the financial capital, which basically makes huge decisions, and they're intimately tied up with other kinds of capitalist elites, and they're tied to political parties like the provincial Conservatives, which are like sort of have a handle on the main groupings of capital in our cities, in our city, and that's who these people serve. Even if they want to be able to spend money on public transit, they're subservient to other kinds of interests. And I don't mean just in a sneaky way. In terms of that's how they look at the world. I think it's mostly how they work at the world, because it's a lazy populist analysis to say, oh, just because they're crooks or they're bought off. There's reasons why they take money from them. They look at the world a particular way, and that's what we need to challenge. the fact that people in workplaces don't have enough time to organize themselves into unions, or the fact that working people in communities have trouble being able to sit down and analyze how can I be proactive in these kinds of movements, is conscious. The ruling stratum of our society disorganizes the potential of working class people to be able to become, proactive and all that kind of stuff. And that's part of what we're fighting against, in ourselves and our families and everything, all this kind of stuff.
In Ontario, it's particularly difficult now under Ford. There's just so many fronts to be fighting on. So although you do have networks, they've got their hands full too, with specific legislation that they've got to push back on, and, that might be related to transit, might not be. And then, yeah, you look to the person next to you and they're fighting a completely different battle, maybe on a school board level. And
a lot of the funding for cities and public transit is based upon, it used to be 50% of the operations that was funded by the provincial government. That changed with Harris. And when the Liberals got elected, they didn't change it back. So, the cities are so much, it's interesting, are so much of the tool of the more powerful province. And look what they transformed the city council. They have this powerful mayor, a whole series of things. They have this thing where they can actually step in and prevent, say, a non-market solution to housing by simply saying that what they call a ministerial order, we can build this, and they're not funding public transit that way. So it means that doesn't mean cities can't do anything, and a lot of our work is around the city. We can, from what Jamie was saying in terms of building, putting pressure on, and we get things. We've won things that way, but you also have the fact that the worst kind of elites are backed by the conservative, the Ontario conservative PCs, they call themselves, in Ontario. And part of that means to change the provincial government, and that's part of the constraints that TTC Riders works under,
We've waded into politics pretty deeply at this point, so, I've got to ask about the Toronto mayoral race. I'm sure you folks have very specific demands or questions, concerns that you have coming out of these campaigns. Is TTC Riders backing a candidate? What's their approach here during this very important race?
As far as I'm aware, and Herman, please clarify for me, we're not backing any candidates. I think TTC Riders certainly wants to see whoever is elected be very supportive of funding transit, increasing service and reversing the service cuts, and looking at non-confrontational ways of solving safety issues, so not just police, but finding ways to also fix the underlying issues that are causing the safety concerns, but also having better support systems on the system, like on the subway system, to fix safety concerns when they arise. I think those are the major points, and of course bus lanes and other issues that TTC Riders has been advocating for.
It's a little harder to get bus lanes, debated on, right? They like to talk about taxes, and this law and order narrative is pretty heavy, and it centers pretty much on transit. Herman, how are you feeling about this race? Jamie talked about, funding and wanting someone who would adequately fund transit. You guys spend $33 million a day on police. Does that pretty much exclude any current counselors running? Because they've not done a great job funding you so far.
We don't. Jamie basically summarized, and Jamie was very active in a very the safety stuff that we've done around the way we responded to that onslaught that came. That ideological onslaught was very reasonable, and Jamie sort of summarized what we've been saying around it. But no, the law and order thing has not been the main topic in the election. The right wing, some people have tried to make it such, but it hasn't had the resonance that it had made a couple of months ago. It might, if you've noticed. And our issues are, what we did is, as Jamie was saying, we basically had this scorecard. like a questionnaire, and we asked, I think there are 23 questions, and we interviewed some of the candidates around critical issues that Jamie mentioned, including like this commercial parking levy that would help to fund,
As a revenue tool, right?
as a revenue tool. We don't have huge revenue tools, and also, some of them are talking about raising taxes on the wealthy, and even property tax increases that would be progressive in the sense that they would only affect, say, people with houses that are worth $3 million or so or more, and that sort of stuff. But no, we can't take a position on a particular candidate. But it's pretty obvious what those who articulate what we're interested in and have our particular points of view, and that's what we're doing. And we also have something we're going to do around getting people to vote, because part of the problem is that a lot of the people who are affected by the issues that we're concerned about don't necessarily get out and vote. Particularly, this is like a by-election, although, and so this is part of what we're trying to do in terms of getting people to understand this and come out. So.
Well, we'll link people to the scores on your report cards. They can see for themselves where people were answering. Is there anything else that you want our audience to know? You got anything else up your sleeve that we should know about, get excited about?
I think we covered a lot of the things we're doing, and I guess one of the issues that is really important is to replace the Scarborough RT, which a lot of people didn't even know was going to be closed down, with a dedicated busway, which would be would replace this broken down technology, and it also would allow people to walk, to bike, and it also would be dedicated as much as we possibly can, and it needs to be funded. It's like the stuff that Jamie was mentioning, that the politicians promise, they'll bus lanes or they'll build the busway, but they won't fund it. We want these things funded. And yeah, maybe some of the money that's going into policing, increasing policing, doesn't mean that, police are necessarily bad, but increasing dealing with safety as a way of sort of militarizing the subways isn't necessarily what we want. We can take that funding and use it partly for resources that, to deal with people who have issues. But and there's reasons why there's more, because it has to do with the cuts that have been made, and use it to fund things like public transit. We basically don't want the austerity agenda, which has racked our city council for years. Remember when I talked about how Ford always used to say, "Oh, what about efficiencies?" It's all about cutting. He's saying if you want, even now he's saying you want more money for the province, you have to have proof that you can efficiencies, which means cuts. So it's that kind of a thing that we're hoping people talk more about during this election, and transit is a critical part about that. So.
Adding on to what Herman was saying at the beginning there, a lot of people don't know about the changes happening to transit in Toronto, and especially the Scarborough RT. A lot of people don't know that that's going to be closing in November of this year. So if you have the time and are interested, I would definitely recommend just going out and going to one of our canvassing and flyering events. It educates people who use the line, and that helps them, but it also mobilizes more people to advocate for better transit, and that pushes the politicians to make change.
Jamie, it's almost like you knew what my last question was going to be, and I was going to throw it to you. What do you want from the audience? What would you ask of them? And you did it. So I'm just going to thank you folks so much for taking the time to come on, because I can hear that you're busy people, even just with TTC Riders on your plate. There's just so much work there to do. We will try to amplify your work through the show. And again, we'll share as many links back to your work as we can. Again, thank you for your advocacy and your work. Not everybody does this, and the show hopes to aim to bolster your ranks a bit, maybe not directly with your organization, but, we're all working towards that same kind of vision of equity. So thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Herman. Enjoy your Friday night.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having us on.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.